Uh, Good morning, everybody, and greetings from the most northerly of the Channel Islands, where it's a glorious day. The slide here shows Snae Fell, which is the Isle of Man's highest hill, or mountain as they prefer to call it. And from there you can see 7 kingdoms: England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, the sea, and of course the kingdom of heaven. Now, before I start this talk, I must declare 2 interests. First of all, my wife, Liz Charter, is the author of the Isle of Man Government Biodiversity Strategy, although the opinions you'll hear today are mine, because most of her time is spent looking out of our flat window at birds that can be seen. If I look up like that, it means I'm watching choughs going past the window. I'm also a director of Alderney Bird Observatory, which was the brainchild of Catherine's husband, Paul Verron. And it's quite interesting, really, because when Paul was a young lad and used to come out bird watching with me, his ambition was to become a warden of the Calf Bird Observatory, of which I now have a little bit of interest. Excuse me. A wanton destruction of habitats and loss of wildlife worldwide has happened on my watch as a naturalist and nature conservationist. My generation has failed our children and grandchildren like no other, despite the best efforts of individuals and organisations. Derek Gow, who's a farmer and rewilding enthusiast, says there'll be a lot of people out there who are not going to like this. They like to do things very slowly and consider every option. Have another cup of tea, have another Kipling cake, have another wee chat in 4 months' time. If we keep on course with this, we'll be left living in a planet full of pigeons and dogs on the beaten down crust of our own excrement. The blame can and should be laid squarely on the shoulders of politicians. Not only do governments own much of the natural world, they lay down the laws that all of us have to obey. This is the Isle of Man government that meets once a year on Tynwald Hill. And as you can see, it's always sunshine in the Isle of Man. This presentation is a call to political action. Many wildlife habitats can be restored, rejuvenated, species help to withstand the onslaught of humanity. It's not just a matter of stopping the degradation, but also restoring our natural habitats. The Isle of Man government wants to see at least 16% of the area of degraded marine, freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems restored by 2025. When we signed up to the biodiversity strategy, the Isle of Man government extended the period in which they wanted to implement it by 5 years. They'll have to get a move on, as little more than eating a few Kipling cakes has been done in the last 5 years. In a statement issued for this presentation, the Department of Environment, Food, Agriculture, DEFA, says areas where much has been accomplished include Action 9, making biological records available to the public on the NBN Atlas Isle of Man. Action 13, the Biosphere Isle of Man project, working together for a sustainable future, for which we expect to publish a vision and strategy shortly. Action 18, marine nature reserves. We work with fishermen and conservationists to promote sustainable management and restoration of the marine environment. However, Kate Jennings, author of Lost Decade for Nature and head of site conservation policy at the RSPB, says of the UK's progress, what we have seen is an awful lot of positive rhetoric, What we're not seeing is the action to back that up. The government creates an impression, I'm quoting from her still, the government creates an impression of taking this stuff seriously, but as soon as you dig down into the action, that's not reflected. DEFRA has been occupied by first-time junior ministers with little political experience for the last 22 years at least. I'm going to concentrate on situations in the Isle of Man, although some of the lessons can be applied equally to Alderney, Guernsey and Jersey. I'll be looking at the uplands, nature reserves and beaches and dogs. According to the Manx government, and I quote, the uplands are an iconic part of our landscape and heritage. Patriotic reference to the sweet mountain air and green hills and rocks are enshrined in the Manx national anthem. The government goes on to say, and the colours of the heather and gorse are woven into the very fabric of Manx tartan. Yet for some, they're also a place to work. And for others, a place to exercise or simply enjoy open space. And here I end the quote. This is a winter hen harrier roost site with up to 15 birds settling down each evening next to this scramble track. And if you look very carefully, you can see two motorcyclists using the scramble track photographed last Sunday. Frank Fraser-Darling says about the Scottish uplands, the bald, unpalatable fact is emphasised that the highlands and islands are largely a devastated terrain. They are, in his words, a wet desert. We can apply that to Manx uplands too. DEFRA instigated a working group of the uplands stakeholders to identify the diverse uses and values of the uplands and to develop a vision for the future of the department's uplands estate and adjoining lands. They said this group is being chaired by Professor Jim McAdam of the Glenwerry Hill Regeneration Partnership in Northern Ireland, who will ensure that the views of all parties are fairly represented. Among other contentious proposals, he wants to see the development of walk-up grouse shooting estates. These involve expensive management of heather by burning and predator control. They do not aid water management and they don't help to build good soils, instead encouraging soil erosion. They don't produce much oxygen or store as much carbon as the same land would if regenerated with native trees, shrubs and plants. Another great curse of the uplands is the dominance of open range sheep farming. The original scrub and woodlands were, of course, mainly destroyed several centuries ago. If our great-grandparents returned today, their first questions would be, where are the trees? Where are the birds? Where is the cotton grass? Production of food is an important and obvious function of hill land, DEFRA say, yet the whole of the island's agriculture accounts for just 1% of GDP, for which we destroy huge swathes of the countryside while persuading people that the view is magnificent, wonderful, iconic. Upland sheep farming has to be subsidised to break even. We have to change and have to recognise the urgency of changing, and it's essential that much more than half of our degraded moors and glens must be reforested as soon as possible. Only then will our descendants have a chance to live in a restored and healthy environment. Dark lifeless plantations of Sitka spruce and woolly maggots is not the way to cover our once magnificent, wonderful, iconic hills. An island of 221 square miles has only one national nature reserve, although several others deserve the title and protection that come with it. 25 reserves are owned or run by Manx Wildlife Trust. The main feature of the Ayres National Nature Reserve in the north of the island is the extensive area of lichen heath. This habitat type cannot be found elsewhere on the island and occurs only in small patches in the UK. The reserve has several breeding bird species that are rare or in rapid decline. Curlew, skylark and little tern are the most notable. It's a major dog emptying point, crisscrossed by many paths. The invention of long leashes makes the spring ban on loose dogs almost worthless. The Ayres NNR shoreline is the only place on the island where little terns breed, unsuccessfully this year. Arctic terns nest on a huge shingle bank which has to be roped off for the birds' protection at the point of air outside the National Nature Reserve. This still does not prevent disturbance from people or dogs. The birds abandoned the site this year, but the cause is yet unknown. Maybe it too will become part of the Ayres National Nature Reserve in the next 10 years. I sincerely hope so. If that is to be achieved, it will be due to this major long-term restoration Manx BirdLife project, started last year in partnership with Island Aggregates, who dug out these gravel pits, and the RSPB to create a very special place for birds and people. With potential to grow to more than 450 acres, the reserve will offer a mix of freshwater and dry heathland habitats. Crucially, it will link the Ayres National Nature Reserve to the point of Ayre, where the Arctic terns breed and which is a hotspot place for tourists and locals to visit. The Belaf Currachs Ramsar site was designated on the 6th of September 2006. The Currachs, or Belaf Currachs, are a wetland in Belaf Parish in the northwest of the Isle of Man. The area had rich and varied biodiversity and is also the location of the Currachs Wildlife Park, a zoo within the wetlands. The zoo is government run and costs taxpayers in excess of £300,000 a year. The Currachs once boasted Europe's largest winter hen harrier roost with more than 100 birds a night, but that has now gone. Wallabies escaped from the zoo, as did several other non-native species, the latest of which was a red panda that managed to get out 3 times, and have increased in number exponentially. Some people blame them for disturbing the hen harrier roost to such an extent that it moved away. Vegetation has been devoured by wallabies to a height of 1 metre throughout the Currachs. Lack of management has resulted in succession wet woodland moving in. It's not all bad news, though. Our government has recently taken this in hand and state Belaf Currachs restoration in the core area discussed by the Belaf Currachs Restoration Group and planned via the Action for Wildlife programme coordinated by the Manx Wildlife Trust. Langness, Sandwich and Derbyhaven, ASSI, are 3 sites which make up the Langness Peninsula. They're designated as an ASSI, which government recognises as a factor to be considered in planning operations. A loose group has been formed to restore the area using a number of key species as indicators. These include the nationally rare lesser mottled grasshopper, breeding skylarks, lapwings, and redshank. The last two have been lost in recent years. The beaches are vital places for breeding, wintering, and migrating birds. The Isle of Man holds the highest concentration of the charismatic and much enjoyed red-billed chough. Sorry, Jersey. Disturbance.
Wrap up shortly, please.
Pardon?
Do you wrap up shortly? So we've got some time for questions.
Okay, it won't be long. Disturbance from dog walkers is constant, even after dark. Derby Haven has two attractions for birds, mud for feeding and a breakwater which is cut off at high tide for roosting. A flock of pale-bellied Brent geese spend the winter here. And as I speak, bar-tailed godwits are poking in the mud, eider ducks diving for crustacea, and up to 300 curlews and oyster catchers roosting on the breakwater. The Calf of Man Bird Observatory was set up 60 years ago. I'd like to say it's world famous, but in reality, few Manx people have any idea of its work, reputation, and potential. Its work is completely up to date, employing all the requirements set down by the Bird Observatories Council for accreditation. Stuck in a time warp, the observatory buildings are quaint, rustic, and quite behind the times. Known as much as a place for stag and hen parties, and I kid you not, the accommodation season ends at the beginning of September, just as a bird migration gets into full flow. The eradication of rats has seen the return of Manx shearwaters to breed. The Isle of Man was lucky to have a bird named after it, but does little to exploit the potential of ecotourism to see this and other exciting species. The littoral zone is the rarest habitat in the world, and as islanders, we all have no appreciation of that fact. The majority of the world's residents have never seen the sea or a beach. Start walking at low tide on Calais, and you'll carry on for 2,600 kilometres before you reach the next 100-metre strand, except on the Black Sea, it's only about 5 metres wide. Do you remember the government's marine nature reserves? We work with fishermen and conservationists to promote sustainable management and restoration of the marine environment. Well, we don't do that too well either. Fishermen and conservationists are outraged to learn that 2 trenches for fibre optic cables will go through merle beds in marine nature reserves and up the beaches. Disturbance includes boat launching, jet skis, surfers, especially those with kites, which scare the living daylights out of birds. COVID has increased the use of beaches for recreation. In summary, political elevation is essential for the restoration of wildlife. It can't be left to junior ministers and weak departments. The uplands are ideal for rewilding to turn into their original state. Nature reserves would be great to see extra protection, particularly control of dogs. Bird observatories could be enhanced, and here I include Alderney, for their educational capacity. Beaches should be appreciated for their rarity and have improved protection. Dogs need more dedicated pet parks where people can go and empty them without affecting wildlife, and greater control of ownership. And finally, politicians, we should support environmentally aware candidates and push wildlife conservation up the political ladder.